I was 29, standing in a hospital corridor with my 6-month-old twins pressed against my chest when the machines went quiet and the world thinned to a whisper. Mark was gone, and the people who promised forever studied their shoes instead of my face. Someone squeezed my arm and said they were so sorry, then drifted toward the elevators as if grief were contagious. Lila's whimper rose into a cry. Owen hiccuped and went silent in that way that made my heart race. I called my parents and got a sigh, my sister, and got a voicemail. Mark's father and got a door half opened, then shut. The church smelled like lilies and lemon oil, and when the last hymn ended, the pews emptied faster than the parking lot at closing time. Back in our apartment, bottles stacked beside the sink, and the dryer rattled like it might shake loose from the wall. I told myself I could carry all of it alone until the twins cried at the same time and the floor felt closer than the couch. Then the rain started, and headlights slid across my blinds, and an umbrella and a briefcase appeared at my door with the man my family swore I should never trust. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to rebuild when help never came. My name is Nora Bennett. I grew up in a 1-story house with a patchy yard and a mother who ironed shirts for the extra $5, a father who believed a promise mattered even when it hurt, and a sister who learned early that the world stepped aside for the loudest voice. We were not rich, but we said please and thank you. We brought casseroles when neighbors lost their jobs, and we passed the same hand-me-down winter coats back and forth each year. There was a family fault line we didn't talk about. My mother's father, Walter Pierce, left home with a suitcase at 19 and built something colossal out of hard numbers and restless nights. And somewhere along the way, the gratitude turned to resentment, the calls turned to silence, and our holiday table grew smaller. I knew him by photographs clipped from business magazines and by a name spoken like a caution sign. I learned early that success could be proof or provocation, depending on who was watching. I met Mark at the county fair of all places, under a strand of lights that made everything look softer. He had a second-hand guitar and a way of listening like there was no clock on the wall. We married in a borrowed church and started with a couch held together by tape, 2 mismatched mugs, and a promise to make it work without asking anyone for more than advice. When the twins came, the apartment shrank in the best possible way. There were bottles in the dish rack and soft socks in every chair cushion. We made a schedule taped to the fridge, his night shifts, my part-time hours, who would pick up diapers and who would cook. Then a flu that wasn't just the flu, and a fever that spiked, and a hospital that smelled like bleach and coffee, and a hallway that got very long, very fast. There are calls you make because you need practical help. Could you sit with the babies? Could you bring soup? Could you stand in the doorway and remind me that I am not dreaming? And there are calls you make because you need to hear a familiar voice say your name. I made both kinds. My mother said she and Dad were too old for this kind of thing, and maybe I should rest while the babies nap. My sister texted a heart and a calendar suggestion for a better time to talk. Mark's father cracked the door and glanced down the hallway, like a neighbor might see. He said without Mark there, we should be realistic about expectations. I stood there with Owen on my hip and Lila in the car seat, and felt the apartment tilt in the way buildings do during a windstorm, not enough to fall, but enough to make you look for the nearest doorframe. That night, the twins cried like their small bodies couldn't hold the sound. I rocked Lila until my arms burned, then traded places with Owen and whispered the same promise I'd been whispering since the day they were born. I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. When the knock came, it wasn't hesitant. It had weight, as if the person on the other side had never learned to ask permission to enter a room. I opened the door to a man taller than the doorway would allow, silver hair combed back, rain stitched across the shoulders of a dark coat, a briefcase in one hand and an umbrella in the other. He said my name once, like a statement and not a question, and I knew him before he introduced himself. Photographs had done a poor job of scaling him. "You and the children are coming with me," he said, the way some people say grace, and it did not feel like a command. It felt like a hand extended across a river that had been rising for years. I looked over his shoulder at the rain at the parking lot where the light flickered, and then steadied at the stack of bottles by the sink, at the two tiny faces that had remade every room in my life. The apartment had been our start, but not our safety. He did not make speeches about legacy or enemies or the cost of pride. He set the umbrella by the door, crossed the room in 3 long strides, and lifted Lila with a gentleness that made my throat ache. "Bring the babies," he said, "the rest can wait." In the car, the leather was cold, and the windows fogged in the corners. Owen's fist went slack around my finger, and Lila sighed in that sleep sound like paper folding. Walter watched the road the way you watch a ledger, calm and alert. We passed the parts of town I knew by foot and turned toward the stretch of highway I had always imagined led away from us, not toward anything at all. I asked him why now, after all these quiet years. He said he had buried a wife with a son still in diapers and learned the hard way how silence can look like strength from far away. When the iron gates swung open, it felt less like entering a different world than entering the future I hadn't dared sketch. The house beyond glowed the way good kitchens do at supper time, and a man in a dark suit opened the door before Walter cut the engine. Inside, there were hands that took my wet coat, and a room where 2 cribs already waited, made up with soft blankets, and a shelf lined with things I had been counting down to buy. I stood very still and tried to understand the math of it, years of distance, 1 long drive, and a nursery prepared, as if expectation had been sitting at the window all week. Walter said we would eat, and then I would sleep, and in the morning there would be a plan. He did not say what the plan was, only that it would not involve me doing this alone. I lay awake under a heavy quilt and listened to a house that settled without complaint to the twins breathing in the next room, to footsteps fading down a corridor I would learn by heart. Somewhere between the 2nd and 3rd hour, the question I'd been circling all night walked right up to me and waited. If this door had opened, what would the people who turned away do when they saw it? The answer would come sooner than I expected, and it would not arrive alone. Morning sunlight drifted through tall windows, warming the edge of the blanket that had slipped to the floor. For a few seconds, I didn't remember where I was. The ceiling above me wasn't cracked, and the air didn't smell like mildew or baby formula. Then, I heard soft voices down the hall, one deep and steady, the other high and bubbling with laughter. Walter was holding Lila, his gray suit jacket, dotted with milk spots, smiling as if the sound of a baby's giggle was worth more than the companies he owned. Owen's tiny fists reached for him from the bassinet, and Walter chuckled, passing Lila into my arms. "Breakfast first," he said. "You'll need your strength." In the dining room, the table was already set with fresh fruit, warm bread, and a pot of coffee that smelled stronger than anything I'd brewed in months. Walter sat at the head reading the newspaper. When I hesitated in the doorway, he folded it neatly and gestured to the seat beside him. "Sit, Nora. Eat." I did as he asked, unsure if I was hungry or simply trying to remember how it felt to be cared for. Between bites, he spoke in that quiet, deliberate way that left no room for argument. "You don't owe me gratitude," he said. "You owe yourself a promise to learn to grow and to stand on your own 2 feet again." I looked down at the plate. "I wouldn't know where to start," I admitted. "I don't even have a degree in business. I barely kept our bills straight." Walter leaned back, eyes narrowing just enough to study me the way a builder studies a beam before deciding if it will hold. "You'll start with me," he said. "You'll sit in meetings. You'll listen. You'll ask questions. And when you fail, and you will, you'll try again." His tone carried no threat, only certainty. That afternoon, he kept his word. We drove downtown to a high-rise with mirrored windows that caught the sky. Inside, the elevator doors opened to a boardroom lined with dark wood and quiet power. Men and women in tailored suits nodded to Walter, their eyes flicking toward me with polite curiosity. He didn't introduce me as his granddaughter, only said, "This is Nora. She's joining us." For the next hour, I sat in silence, clutching my notebook, while words like acquisition liquidity and forecast filled the room. Every time my mind drifted to whether the twins had taken their bottles, Walter tapped his pen lightly against the table, a signal to pay attention. By evening, my head was spinning. Back at the mansion, the twins were asleep, and the hallways glowed with low lamplight. Walter appeared in the doorway of the study, carrying a stack of papers. "Sit," he said, placing them in front of me. "Balance sheets. Tell me what you see." The numbers blurred together, but I traced each column until I began to notice patterns, expenses, profits, margins that hinted at stories behind them. "It doesn't make sense yet," I admitted. He nodded once. "Keep looking until it does." That became our nightly ritual. When the babies slept, I studied. When exhaustion pressed behind my eyes, he poured another cup of coffee and said, 5 more minutes. Some nights I wanted to quit. I'd close the ledgers and whisper, "Maybe I'm not cut out for this." Walter never raised his voice. He would just look up from his own papers and say, "Nora, you carried 2 infants through grief and survived every night alone. That's not weakness. That's resilience. You belong in any room you walk into." His faith filled the spaces where mine had worn thin. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of the house began to change. The twins learned to sit up. Lila's laugh turned into a melody that followed me through the hallways. I started to understand the flow of reports and meetings, the way decisions built on one another, like a bridge taking shape. Delia often found me asleep at the desk pen still in hand and would drape a blanket over my shoulders without a word. Arthur kept the nursery stocked with diapers and bottles so I could focus without guilt. Walter, for all his discipline, made sure I didn't forget the reason behind the lessons every evening. He knelt beside the cribs, whispering nonsense stories until both babies drifted off. It was during one of those late nights, surrounded by papers and the soft hum of the heater, that the first spark of something new found me. I'd been flipping through a report on household goods when a line about manufacturing costs caught my eye. My mind drifted back to the nights when I couldn't afford safe baby lotion or decent bottles. The memory wasn't bitter, it was practical. What if I could make something better? I scribbled notes on a pad. Organic ingredients, gentle formulas, fair pricing. The name came without effort, Little Haven. I showed the sketch to Walter the next morning. He studied it, running a thumb along the edge of the paper. Now that he said isn't surviving, that's building. He leaned back, a faint smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "Do it." The next few weeks were a blur of small steps and late nights. I researched suppliers, compared costs, and sent cautious emails. The first meeting was with a man named Mr. Kent, whose office smelled of polished wood and old cigars. He looked at me over his glasses, unimpressed. "You're very young, Mrs. Bennett," he said, "and you don't look like someone who knows how to run a company." My hands trembled in my lap. Then I remembered Walter's words, "You belong in any room you walk into." I met Mr. Kent's stare. I buried my husband. "I've raised twins alone. I know how to survive," I said quietly. "If I can do that, I can run a business." The silence that followed stretched long enough to make me doubt myself. Then he exhaled, sat back, and said, "You've got grit. I'll take a small order." It was barely enough to matter on paper, but it felt like the first rung of a ladder. Back home, I told Walter what had happened. He didn't congratulate me with words. He simply poured 2 glasses of iced tea, handed me one, and said, "Now do it 10,000 times more." His grin softened the sharp edge of the challenge. You can celebrate when you've built something that outlives you. Days turned into months. The first shipment arrived late and half damaged. The packaging leaked, the printer misspelled the label, and Owen managed to knock over a bottle before the photo shoot. But one customer turned into 3, then 10, then 100. I stayed up past midnight answering emails from mothers who said they finally found something gentle enough for their babies. Each message steadied me. Each order reminded me that the world could be rebuilt one small act of persistence at a time. By Lila and Owen's first birthday, the company was modest but real. There were shelves in stores across town, boxes stacked in Walter's garage, and laughter echoing through rooms that had once held only grief. On the day we reached our first 1,000 orders, I ran to Walter's study phone in hand. "We did it," I said. He looked up from his paperwork, the corners of his mouth lifting. "Good," he said. "Now keep going." That night, after the twins were asleep, I stood by the nursery window, watching rain blur the reflection of the city lights. The ache of those first nights alone hadn't disappeared. It had only changed shape. I thought of my parents, my sister, and the silence that had followed Mark's funeral. I hadn't heard a word from them since, but success, I would soon learn, has a way of stirring the quiet. I didn't know it yet, but the world that once forgot us was about to come knocking again. And this time, I wouldn't be standing at the door empty-handed. The first time my name appeared in the paper, it felt strange seeing it printed in black and white. Young Widow Builds Family Brand, the headline read. There was a photograph of me holding Lila on my lap while Owen chewed on the corner of a product box. Behind the picture was our home office, half nursery, half warehouse, filled with stacked cartons labeled Little Haven. It had been 3 years since Mark's death, 3 years since that knock on the door that changed everything. What had started as a small idea written in the quiet hours after the twins' bedtime had grown into something much larger. We were still small compared to Walter's empire, but Little Haven had found its own rhythm. Our baby lotions and bottles filled shelves across Kentucky, and customer photos lined our website. Smiling faces, handwritten thank yous, and stories of exhausted mothers who finally found something gentle enough for their children. I had hired 3 employees, all young mothers, who knew what it meant to work between feedings and nap schedules. Every milestone felt like a victory we could share. Walter never treated the success like a miracle. To him, it was math and persistence. Momentum doesn't mean you stop pushing, he told me one evening as we reviewed quarterly numbers at the long oak table. It just means you've proved you can keep going. He said it with a faint smile that softened his usual sharp tone, and I understood it as the closest thing to praise he'd ever give. But good news travels faster than loyalty. The morning after that article ran, the phone started ringing in a way it hadn't for years. I didn't recognize the first number. Nora, a familiar voice, sang through the receiver. "Sweetheart, it's Mom. I just read about you in the paper. Oh, honey, you've done so well. I miss you. I miss my grandbabies. Why don't you bring them by? It's been too long." For a moment, I couldn't find my voice. It had been silence 3 whole years of silence, and now the tone on the other end was sugar smooth, as if none of it had happened. I looked toward the playroom where Lila was stacking blocks, while Owen tried to steal one from her hand. "You told me to figure it out," I said quietly. "You said you were too old to help." Marilyn hesitated. "That was a difficult time for everyone," she said, her voice tightening. "We were grieving too, Nora. Surely you can understand." I didn't answer right away. The twins were laughing now, oblivious to the words drifting through the room. "I'll think about it," I said, and hung up before she could say more. A week later, another envelope arrived, thick and expensive. It was from Mark's father, Douglas Turner. The letter was polite, but every line carried the same undertone business. "We may have had misunderstandings in the past," he wrote, "but family is family. Perhaps we could discuss combining efforts. With your company and our resources, we could build something unstoppable." I set the letter down and stared at it until the words blurred. The man who had shut the door in my face when I held his crying grandson now wanted to combine efforts. My chest tightened, not with pain this time, but with something sharper clarity. That night, I brought it up to Walter. He was sitting by the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in hand, the glow tracing the edges of his weathered face. "They all want something now," I said. "Where were they when I was begging for help?" Walter's expression didn't change. He let the silence sit for a while before speaking. "Do you know why they're reaching out?" he asked. "Because they're hypocrites," I said bitterly. He shook his head slightly. "Because success changes the way parasites see you," he said quietly. "When you were weak, you were useless. Now that you're strong, you're valuable. Don't confuse their greed for love." His words landed like stones, heavy, but solid enough to stand on. A few days later, Arthur came to the study while I was sorting shipment invoices. "Miss Bennett," he said carefully, "there's a woman at the gate. She says she's your sister." My pen froze mid-stroke. "Rachel." "Yes, ma'am. She insists it's urgent." I hesitated, but curiosity won. The air outside carried the soft chill of spring rain. Rachel stood by the gate in a cream coat and oversized sunglasses, holding a ribboned box that looked straight out of a department store. She smiled wide when she saw me. "Nora, you look amazing. I can't believe this place. It's like a movie." I folded my arms. "You didn't return my calls when Mark died." Her smile faltered for a second before snapping back. "We all make mistakes," she said lightly. "I brought a gift for the kids. Can I come in?" Before I could answer, Walter appeared beside me. His cane tapped once against the stones, a sound that seemed to carry its own authority. Rachel stiffened as his shadow fell across the drive. "Family doesn't abandon its own," he said evenly, "and then knock when fortune comes calling. Go home." Rachel's cheeks flushed pink. "You can't keep her from us forever," she said, her voice rising. I stepped forward before Walter could reply. "He's not keeping me from anyone," I said quietly. "You lost me when you turned your back." Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. For a second she looked like the sister I'd grown up with, the one who shared a bedroom and whispered secrets after lights out. Then she turned sharply and walked away, her heels clicking against the wet stone until the gate closed behind her. Walter placed a hand on my shoulder, steady and warm. "You're learning," he said. "Love is proven in the dark, not the light." After that day, word spread quickly through the family. Old friends who hadn't spoken in years sent messages just to reconnect. My mother left a second voicemail, this one full of exaggerated laughter, about how proud she was. It was strange hearing her use that word proud, like she'd earned the right to say it. But beneath the polite greetings, there was movement I couldn't ignore. Names I hadn't spoken aloud in years started surfacing in conversations I didn't start. Business associates mentioned that someone had been asking questions about Little Haven's ownership. One morning, Arthur handed me a delivery notice stamped from a local attorney's office. Walter read it first, his expression hardening. "They're preparing something," he said. "They'll come soon, and when they do, you'll stand on your own this time." The waiting felt longer than it was. Every creak of the gate, every phone ring sounded sharper closer. The twins, now nearly 4, filled the house with drawings taped to every wall, the laughter that chased shadows away. Yet beneath it I could feel the storm building. One Saturday evening, as Delia and I set the table for dinner, Arthur rushed in from the foyer, his usually calm voice trembling. "Miss Bennett, there's a crowd at the gate, your parents, your sister, and Mr. Turner. They're demanding to see you." The sound of plates clinking against the table stopped. My heart tightened. Walter stepped into the doorway, his cane tapping once against the floor. "Let them in," he said, his voice quiet but certain. "This time, it's your fight." As the front doors opened, the scent of rain and tension filled the hall. I saw them step inside, the parents who had left me to grieve alone, the sister who found her voice only after the headlines, and the man who once said I was nothing without his son. Each face carried the same look, polite determination, hiding greed. My mother spoke first, her tone falsely bright. "Nora, look at this house. You've done so well for yourself." I met her gaze steady and calm. "What do you want?" Before she could answer, Douglas stepped forward, slamming a folder onto the table. "Rights," he said sharply. "As Mark's father, I have claims over his share of this empire, and you, as his widow, have a duty to share with his bloodline." The sound of thunder rolled outside, as if the sky itself wanted to answer him. I looked from one face to another, the people who had turned their backs when I needed them most. For the first time, I didn't feel small in their presence. I didn't feel like the daughter or daughter-in-law begging to be seen. I felt like someone who had already built something no one could take. I straightened my shoulders, my voice even. "If you came here to talk about duty," I said, "then we'll talk about who failed theirs first." The silence that followed was deep enough to feel like the air had stopped moving. Outside, lightning flashed against the iron gates. Inside, the storm had finally arrived. Douglas Turner's words hung in the air like a strike of thunder. He'd called my life an empire, his tone sharp and claiming. Behind him, my parents and sisters stood close, each of them wearing that rehearsed calm that came before a storm. I looked down at the folder on the table, its corners damp from the rain that had followed them inside. My fingers brushed the edge of the papers, and something inside me steadied. Claims, I repeated quietly. "You closed your door in my face when I asked for milk money for your grandson. Now you want to talk about duty." My voice surprised me. It didn't shake. Douglas's jaw clenched. "That was the past," he said. "This is business, and business requires fairness. You owe," I cut him off. You don't get to define fairness when you never lifted a hand for your own son's children. My father Ted stepped forward before Douglas could answer. Nora, calm yourself, he said, his tone low but heavy with warning. We're family. Let's not make this ugly. If you bring us in, we can all benefit. Benefit, I echoed, glancing at the twins peeking from behind the staircase rail. You mean you. You want to benefit from something you didn't build. Rachel shifted uneasily. You're being selfish, she said quickly. We all struggled after Mark died. You weren't the only one. Now you have everything and you're shutting us out. I turned to her, unable to hide the disbelief. When I was sitting in a hospital hallway with 2 crying infants, you told me to call you when things calmed down. When exactly did you struggle? Rachel. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The air in the foyer thickened. My mother finally spoke, her voice trembling with something that might have been anger or guilt. You can't erase us, Nora. We are your blood. You're being ungrateful after everything we did for you growing up. The word ungrateful landed hard, sharper than I expected. For a moment I felt that old ache, the instinct to explain, to apologize. Then I caught Walter's eyes from across the room. He didn't move or speak. He just looked at me with the same quiet certainty he always had, and it was enough. You're right, I said slowly. You are my blood. But blood abandoned me when I needed it most. I turned to Douglas. Family isn't who shares your veins. It's who stays when the world turns its back. Douglas's face reddened. You think you can just erase your husband's family? I have rights as his father, legal ones. I'll take this to court if I have to. Do it, I said. Every order, every contract, every dollar tied to Little Haven is in my name. I built it with my own hands. I have the proof and I have the receipts. The rain outside hit the windows harder, matching the sound of his fist slamming onto the table. You'll regret this. Maybe, I said, but I'll regret it standing on my own 2 feet. The silence that followed was long enough to hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hall. Rachel's eyes glistened with angry tears. You'll see what it feels like to be alone again, she said. I shook my head. I already know what that feels like, I said softly, and I survived. Walter's cane struck the marble floor, once the sound sharp as a gavel. You heard her, he said, his voice calm but commanding. Leave my house, and don't come back. No one argued. They turned toward the door, shoulders stiff, faces pale with shock and fury. The heavy doors shut behind them with a final echo that filled every corner of the room. When the sound faded, my knees gave way. I sat on the bottom step, my hands trembling. Lila climbed into my lap, her small hand pressing against my chest. Mommy, she whispered. Are they gone? Yes, I said, holding her close. They're gone, sweetheart. Walter walked over slowly, his cane tapping the floor. He rested a hand on my shoulder. You fought well tonight, he said quietly. I was terrified, I admitted, still shaking. He nodded. Courage isn't about fear, Nora. It's about standing while you're afraid. He gave a small smile. Tonight you stood taller than I ever have. The storm outside rumbled as if to punctuate his words. The mansion felt different that night, quieter, but lighter somehow. For years I had carried the weight of other people's approval, chasing it like a shadow. With that door closed, the air finally felt clean. Over the next few weeks, the story spread. My parents stopped calling, though a few relatives reached out with polite concern wrapped in curiosity. We heard there was a disagreement, one aunt wrote. Such a shame after all your success. I never replied. Little Haven didn't slow down. If anything, it grew faster. Walter doubled the production line and helped me hire a full operations team. We expanded into neighboring states. Reviews poured in, and a magazine requested an interview for their Women in Business issue. When it came out, Walter clipped the page and framed it. Grit and Grace, the headline read. He pointed to it one evening after dinner. That's you, he said. I laughed, shaking my head. You always said I was stubborn. Stubborn, he replied, is just determination without apology. As months passed, the mansion settled into a new kind of calm. The twins turned 5, full of noise and mischief, filling the halls with chalk drawings and laughter. At night, I would find Walter reading to them by the fire, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it. Those moments felt like a reward for every night I had spent alone, every door that had closed. Still, I sometimes caught him watching me when he thought I wasn't looking, his eyes proud, but tired. He was aging faster than he'd admit. "Promise me something," he said one evening while I reviewed contracts at his desk. "Promise me you'll keep building no matter what happens." "I will." I told him. "I owe it to them and to you." He smiled faintly. "You owe it to yourself." That promise stayed with me. By the end of the year, Little Haven launched nationwide. Orders came in faster than we could fill them. We opened a second warehouse, hired more staff, and started working with hospitals and childcare centers. Then came the invitation that would change everything, a national conference in New York featuring female entrepreneurs sharing their stories. Walter insisted I accept. "It's time people hear where you started," he said, "not from a headline, but from you." The night before the trip, the twins helped me pack. Lila folded dresses into neat piles, while Owen slipped one of his toy cars into the suitcase for luck. Walter stopped by the doorway, smiling at the scene. "You're ready," he said. "Just tell the truth. That's all anyone needs to hear." The next morning, as the car pulled away from the mansion gates, I glanced back. Walter stood beneath the arch, his cane in one hand, the other raised in quiet farewell. I didn't know then how much that image would stay with me. In New York, the stage lights were blinding. Rows of faces blurred into the distance as I stepped up to the microphone. My hands trembled, but the words came anyway. When my husband died, I thought my life ended too. Everyone I trusted turned away. But one man opened his door, my grandfather, and with his belief I built something from nothing, not just a business but a life for my children. Applause filled the room, warm and unforced. In the front row, Walter was there sitting beside the twins, his eyes bright under the lights. For the first time, I wasn't speaking from loss. I was speaking from strength. Afterward, back in the quiet of the hotel room, I looked at Walter's reflection in the window, the city lights flickering behind him. "Grandpa," I said softly, "I want to build something bigger. For Mark, for everyone who's ever been left with nothing." He turned, eyebrows raised. "What do you have in mind?" "A foundation," I said. "To help single parents. Housing, childcare, maybe scholarships someday." Walter studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "That," he said finally, "is the best business plan you've ever written." The next 6 months would prove him right and change everything again. But that night, as the twins slept between us and the hum of the city faded outside, I finally felt what he must have wanted for me all along, peace born from purpose. The following spring, the Pierce estate bloomed brighter than it had in years. Rows of tulips framed the long drive, and the air smelled faintly of lilac and fresh rain. Inside the nursery walls were now covered in crayon art stick figures and uneven hearts that Lila insisted looked just like us. The house felt alive in a way it hadn't before. Little Haven was thriving, and so were we. Orders poured in from all over the country, and investors kept calling, but I remembered what Walter had always said, "Build slow, build strong." So we did. That summer, I registered the Ethan Pierce Foundation in Mark's memory. Walter sat beside me at the lawyer's office, his cane resting against the desk. The paperwork felt heavier than it should have, the kind of weight that carried purpose. "Its mission is simple," I told the attorney. "Support single parents, housing, childcare, financial relief. No one should ever face what I did alone." Walter smiled faintly, his voice rough. "That's not charity, Nora. That's justice." The night before the launch, I couldn't sleep. The twins were 10, now old enough to understand more than I wanted them to. They had spent the evening practicing a small speech they insisted on giving during the ceremony. From the hallway, I heard Owen whispering lines to Lila as if he were coaching her for a school play. Walter walked in with 2 cups of tea and set one beside me. "You've done something rare," he said. "You've built success and remembered the road you walked to get there." I didn't answer at first. The truth was, I still thought of the night I'd collapsed in that dim apartment, the smell of formula, the sound of rain against cracked glass. I never wanted another mother to feel that kind of emptiness. The next day, as we stood beneath a white canopy in front of the new foundation office, cameras clicked and microphones hovered. Walter looked proud but distant, watching every move with the calm patience of someone seeing a full circle close. Reporters asked questions, and I tried to keep my answers steady. I talked about Mark, about the nights that broke me and the lessons that rebuilt me. Then Owen tugged on my dress and stepped to the microphone. "We're doing this for the kids who don't have help," he said in a small, serious voice, "so they can be okay like us." Lila nodded beside him, holding the scissors for the ribbon cutting. When the flashbulbs went off, I saw tears glisten in Walter's eyes. He didn't hide them. Later that evening, the celebration continued back at the mansion. Guests filled the dining room, friends, business partners, families the foundation had already helped. Lila and Owen darted between tables, greeting everyone as if they'd been hosting events their whole lives. Walter stood near the fireplace, shaking hands with donors, his posture proud, but a little more stooped than before. When most of the guests had gone, he called me over quietly. "I've built fortunes and companies," he said, "but tonight you built something better. Legacy." I reached for his hand, startled by how fragile it felt. "Grandpa, I couldn't have done any of this without you." He gave a small shake of his head. "You could have, but I'm glad you didn't have to." The following months passed in a blur of travel and expansion. We opened new grant programs, partnered with hospitals, and reached families in every corner of the state. Walter attended every board meeting he could, but the walks from his room to the car grew slower. Arthur began accompanying him everywhere, always close enough to steady his arm without being asked. I noticed, though, Walter never mentioned it, that he tired more easily, sometimes falling asleep in the chair by the study window with the financial pages folded on his lap. One chilly afternoon, as the trees turned gold, I found him in that same chair. The light had gone soft through the glass, and he looked peaceful. "Do you remember the first night you brought us here?" I asked. "I didn't even know what to pack." He chuckled quietly. "I remember thinking you'd fight me. You looked like you might slam that door." "I almost did," I said. "But you didn't let me." He smiled faintly. "A good door should always open in both directions." That winter, we received an invitation to a national business conference in Washington. The Ethan Pierce Foundation was being recognized for community impact, and they wanted us to speak. Walter insisted on going, though the doctor had told him to rest. The trip was short, only 2 days, but it meant more to him than any award he'd received for his own empire. We sat side by side on stage, the light soft on his silver hair. When my turn came to speak, I looked toward him and said, "Everything I know about resilience came from the man who taught me to never beg at closed doors." The crowd stood in applause, and Walter's eyes met mine, proud, but full of something else. Farewell. When we returned home, he was quieter. He spent more time in the garden, watching the twins chase each other through the tall grass. Sometimes, when the wind caught his hair just right, I saw the young man my mother had described from old photographs, ambitious, fierce, certain. But the strength that once filled every room he entered now flickered like candlelight. One evening after dinner, he asked to see the twins before bed. They climbed into his lap, each holding one of his hands. "You two listen to your mother," he told them, his voice soft but steady. "She's the bravest person I know." Lila leaned against his shoulder. "You're brave too, Grandpa." He smiled. "Maybe, but bravery changes shape. It used to mean fighting the world. Now it means knowing when to rest." He passed away quietly 2 weeks later in that same chair by the window. The house was silent when Arthur came to tell me. Outside, the first snow had started to fall. The twins were asleep, their drawings still taped to his door, crude hearts and stick figures labeled Grandpa. I stood there for a long time, listening to the wind move through the old trees, and realized that the man who had once lifted me from the ashes had given me everything I needed to keep going. The funeral was small, exactly as he'd wanted. Business leaders, family friends, the foundation staff all gathered under gray skies. I spoke briefly, my voice steady, despite the ache behind it. He believed in open doors, I said, not just for me, but for anyone willing to walk through them. Afterward, I placed his cane beside the casket, its polished wood catching the last bit of afternoon light. Back at the mansion, the quiet was heavy. Delia had set tea on the table, and Arthur moved through the rooms with careful steps, as if the house itself might break. The twins sat close to me, holding my hands. Mom, Owen whispered, "Is Grandpa with Daddy?" "Now." I nodded. Yes, sweetheart. And I think they're both proud of us. The days that followed were full of paperwork and sympathy cards, but they blurred together in a haze of routine. Then one morning, a package arrived from Walter's attorney. Inside was a single letter written in his neat, slanted handwriting. Nora. It began. I have left you the house the company shares and the freedom to decide what comes next. Use them well, but don't let them chain you. The real inheritance is what you've already built. I folded the letter and pressed it to my chest. Outside, the twins were laughing again, chasing each other through the snow, their footprints stretching across the lawn. For the first time in a long while, I felt calm. The story that began in a storm had come to a quiet pause, not an ending. There were still new doors ahead waiting to open. As the sun slipped lower, I whispered the promise I had once made to him at that same window years ago. I'll keep building, Grandpa, for them and for you. And somewhere between the fading light and the echo of laughter outside, it felt like he heard me. After Walter's passing, the house felt enormous in ways I hadn't noticed before. Every sound seemed to travel farther, echoing through the halls he used to fill with steady footsteps and quiet advice. His chair by the study window sat untouched, the morning paper still folded on the table beside it. For weeks, I couldn't bring myself to move a thing. Grief came in waves, sudden, unexpected. Sometimes it was the scent of his cologne still faint on the hallway rug, other times a phrase he used to repeat one I could almost hear if the room was still enough. But grief also carried a strange kind of clarity. It reminded me that his lessons weren't meant to end with him. Spring arrived slowly, washing color back into the garden. The twins were 12 now, taller, sharper, each beginning to show hints of the adults they'd become. Lila had her grandfather's determination. Owen had his calm. They still missed him deeply. One morning I found them sitting near the pond, their sketchbooks open, trying to draw the old bench where he'd like to sit. "Do you think Grandpa can see us?" Lila asked. I knelt beside her and nodded. "If he can," I said, "he's probably correcting your perspective." That made her laugh, and for a moment the ache lifted. Little Haven had grown beyond anything I could have predicted. Our products filled national shelves now, and the Ethan Pierce Foundation had helped hundreds of families find stability again. At every event, people would ask how I managed it all, business, motherhood, community work, and I'd always give the same answer with help. It wasn't just Walter's guidance that built this life. It was the countless hands that reached back when I finally dared to reach forward. Still, there were moments of quiet reckoning. Some evenings after the twins went to bed, I'd walk the halls of the mansion and think about the family who had once demanded to share it. I hadn't heard from them since the confrontation years ago, though now and then gossip found its way through mutual acquaintances. My parents had downsized to a smaller home outside Louisville. Rachel was divorced, working part-time, her name occasionally attached to small charity events. Douglas Turner had retired. Each update carried the same bittersweet mixture sadness, for what they could have been relief, that none of it touched me anymore. One Friday afternoon, Arthur knocked gently on my office door. "Miss Bennett," he said, his tone careful, "there's someone here to see you. She says she's family." My chest tightened. I stood expecting another polite ambush, but it wasn't that. When I reached the front hall, Rachel was waiting, hands clasped tightly in front of her. Time had changed her face lines of exhaustion where pride used to be. She looked smaller, somehow, more human. "I didn't come for money," she said quickly. "I just wanted to see you." I hesitated, studying her expression. There was no arrogance left in it, no carefully rehearsed smile, just weariness. "I heard about Grandpa," she added softly. "I should have come sooner." The silence between us stretched until it hurt. "Why now, Rachel?" I asked quietly. "After all these years?" Her eyes filled and her voice cracked. "Because I was wrong. I thought success meant security. I thought if I pretended long enough, life would fix itself. It didn't. I lost my husband, my house, everything I thought mattered. And then I saw what you built, what you turned pain into. I guess I just needed to tell you I'm sorry." The words hung in the air. They weren't dramatic or rehearsed. They were fragile and real. I nodded toward the sitting room. "Come in," I said. We sat across from each other, the space between us heavy with years of silence. She looked around the room, her gaze stopping on the photograph of Walter holding the twins. "He was proud of you," she said. "You know that, right?" "I do," I said. "He gave me more than a roof. He gave me the tools to stop asking for permission." Rachel smiled faintly. "He always scared me a little. I see why you admired him. We talked for over an hour, careful, measured circling old hurts without reopening them. Before she left, she stood by the door and turned back. "I don't expect anything," she said. "But if you ever need help with the foundation, even small things, I'd like to volunteer." It wasn't reconciliation, not entirely, but it was a start. As the door closed behind her, I felt something shift. Forgiveness. I realize doesn't always come with fanfare. Sometimes it just arrives quietly, like an overdue letter finally delivered. That summer, the Foundation's 10th anniversary approached. We planned a gala in the city, simple, elegant, filled with families whose lives had changed because of our work. The twins helped organize choosing photos for the displays and writing notes to include in the programs. "This isn't just about Grandpa anymore," Owen said while sorting through old pictures. "It's about all of them." The night of the event, the ballroom glowed under soft amber lights. I wore a navy gown. Walter would have approved of strong lines, no unnecessary glitter. Lila and Owen stood beside me as we greeted guests, their confidence radiating. When I took the stage, applause filled the room, but it was the sight of familiar faces that caught my breath. Delia near the back, Arthur standing tall by the doors, and unexpectedly Rachel at one of the volunteer tables, helping serve drinks with quiet focus. When the room settled, I began to speak. This foundation began with a single act of kindness. One man opened his door when every other door had closed. He believed family isn't blood, it's love that stays. Tonight we honor not just his memory, but the thousands of families who have proved that starting over is possible. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but it was full, steady, heartfelt. I looked at Lila and Owen, who were clapping hardest of all, and felt the same swell of peace I'd felt years ago in the quiet after a storm. After the gala ended, Rachel approached with a small smile. "You spoke beautifully," she said. "I think he would have been proud of us both." "Maybe so," I said. "You're welcome to stay for dessert if you'd like." She nodded, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'd like that." That night, as the last guests left and the lights dimmed, I stepped outside to the terrace overlooking the city. The air was cool, carrying the scent of rain on concrete. Behind me, the twins were laughing as Arthur herded them toward the car, their voices echoing through the night. I tilted my head to the sky and whispered, "We're still building, Grandpa." The words carried easily, lifted by the wind. Somewhere in the distance, a siren faded, and the world went still again. I didn't know what the next chapter would bring, only that we were ready for it, stronger, grounded, and surrounded by the kind of family that never turns away. The house lights of the city shimmered below countless tiny windows, glowing against the dark. For a moment, it looked like a field of open doors, and I knew without doubt we would keep walking through them. Autumn came with a kind of calm that felt well-earned. The air was cooler, the evenings shorter, and the house that once echoed with grief now held laughter and music again. Little Haven had just opened its 5th regional office, and the foundation had expanded across state lines. For the first time, our programs were helping parents in every corner of the country. When I looked out the window of my study, I could see the twins racing across the garden, their voices carrying across the fading light. They were 14 now, bright, compassionate, still full of questions about the world. Every milestone they reached reminded me of the man who had made it all possible. A framed photo of Walter sat on my desk, the one taken at the foundation's first ribbon cutting. I found myself glancing at it often, as if he were still keeping watch, still reminding me to hold steady. In so many ways he was. The board had just approved a major expansion grant, and our team was preparing to announce a new program focused on education for children of single parents. The work was demanding, but it never felt heavy. It felt like purpose. One quiet evening after finishing emails, I wandered into the kitchen. Delia was setting a pie on the counter, her silver hair tied back as she wiped her hands on a towel. "You're still up?" she said with a smile. "Deadlines," I said, pouring coffee into a mug. "But the good kind." She glanced at me, her expression softening. "He'd be proud of you, you know. All this what you've done, it's what he hoped for." I nodded. "Sometimes I think I can still hear him walking down the hall." Delia chuckled. "That's because you keep his house alive. He'd like that." Later that night, I sat outside on the terrace wrapped in a blanket. The garden below glowed faintly in the moonlight, the same one Walter used to tend himself. I thought about everything that had changed since those early days, the fear, the loneliness, the long climb out of that tiny apartment. It all felt like another lifetime. I had been broken once, but somewhere between sleepless nights and quiet victories, I had learned to rebuild. The next morning, Arthur arrived with the mail as usual. Among the envelopes was a handwritten one addressed to me, no return address. The handwriting was familiar, elegant, deliberate. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded twice. "Dear Nora," it read, "I've watched your story from afar. I wasn't there when you needed me, and I don't expect forgiveness. But I want to see you. One last time." It was signed Mom. I read it twice before setting it down. It had been over a decade since I'd heard from Marilyn. Even after Walter's funeral, she hadn't reached out. I didn't know what she wanted now, but the words "one last time" stayed with me. That evening after dinner, I told the twins. Lila looked worried. "Are you going to go?" she asked. "I don't know yet," I said. "She hurt us deeply, but sometimes time changes people." Owen folded his arms thoughtful. "You always tell us forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. Maybe this is one of those times. Their wisdom always caught me off guard." I smiled faintly. "Maybe it is." A week later, I found myself parked in front of a modest assisted living complex on the outskirts of town. The building was small, tidy, surrounded by oak trees just starting to turn gold. Inside, a nurse led me to a common room where sunlight poured through the windows. My mother sat near the back, a knit shawl draped over her shoulders. She looked older than her years, frail but alert. When she saw me, her hand trembled slightly. "Nora," she said softly. "Mom." The space between us felt wide, filled with all the words that had gone unsaid for so long. I sat across from her, unsure where to start. She beat me to it. "I thought I had more time," she whispered. "Your father passed last spring. Rachel visits when she can, but the days have been long. I wanted to see you before it's too late." I listened, my fingers tracing the edge of my sleeve. "You could have called before now," I said quietly. "There were years you could have." Her eyes glistened. "I know. I thought staying away was easier for you, for everyone. I told myself I was giving you space, but really I was just ashamed." We sat in silence for a while, the sound of distant laughter from the hallway breaking the stillness. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small photograph, me as a child sitting on Walter's lap. "He loved you fiercely," she said. "I never understood that until I lost you both." Her voice cracked on the last word. I took the photo, the edges worn soft from years of handling. For the first time, I saw her not as the woman who had abandoned me, but as someone who had never learned how to be strong the way Walter had. "I don't know if I can forget," I said, "but I can try to forgive." Tears slid down her cheeks. "That's more than I deserve." When I left, the sky was streaked with pink and gold. The air smelled of rain and fallen leaves. As I walked to my car, I felt lighter, not because the past had vanished, but because it no longer held me. Back home, Lila and Owen were waiting in the living room. "How was it?" Lila asked. "It was hard," I said honestly, "but sometimes hard things lead to peace." Owen nodded, thoughtful. "Grandpa would say that forgiveness keeps the door open even if you never walk through it again." I smiled. He would. Weeks later, I received another letter, this one from Rachel. She thanked me for seeing Mom, said it had brought her comfort. She'd also enclosed a newspaper clipping about a local charity event she was organizing with the foundation's support. Her handwriting was steady this time, confident. At the bottom, she had written, "Maybe it's never too late to learn how to stay." Life settled into a new rhythm. The holidays approached, and the mansion filled with visitors, staff friends, and families we'd helped through the foundation. The laughter that echoed through those halls felt different now, deeper somehow. That Christmas Eve, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone by the fireplace with a cup of tea. Outside, snow drifted softly against the windows. On the mantel sat a single candle beside Walter's photograph, its flame steady and bright. I thought about how much had changed since the night he'd found me years ago, a frightened widow in a broken apartment with 2 crying infants. He had opened a door when everyone else turned away. Now that same light reached farther than either of us could have imagined. As the clock chimed midnight, I whispered into the quiet, "Thank you." The candle flickered its reflection, dancing across the glass. For a moment, it felt like an answer. I turned out the lights, letting the glow fade into the warmth of the room. Tomorrow there would be more work to do, more people to help, more doors to open. But for that night, everything was still. Everything was whole. And somewhere deep inside, I could almost hear Walter's voice again, calm, proud, and certain, reminding me that true justice isn't revenge or triumph. It's love that endures. Spring returned quietly the way it always did on the estate. The air smelled of new grass, and the trees along the drive shimmered with the same soft green that once framed my first night here. Years had passed, but the rhythm of this place, its calm and steadiness, had become part of me. The mansion no longer felt like Walter's house. It was home, the kind of home that had been built not with inheritance or wealth, but with work, forgiveness, and love that learned how to stay. Lila and Owen were 17 now, nearly grown, already taller than me. They still spent evenings on the terrace where Walter once read them bedtime stories. Now they talked about college travel and dreams that stretched farther than I had dared to imagine at their age. Watching them, I saw echoes of both the past and the future, his quiet wisdom in their words, and my old resilience shining in their eyes. The Ethan Pierce Foundation had expanded into a national network with programs in every state. Families who once felt invisible now had a safety net. Single parents who had faced the same darkness I once knew stood on stages of their own, sharing how a simple grant or a safe home changed everything. Sometimes they'd send letters, handwritten notes that arrived folded neatly, smelling faintly of coffee or baby lotion. I kept everyone in a wooden box beside my desk. It reminded me that justice wasn't something grand or loud. It was the slow, steady act of choosing to help where others had turned away. On a warm afternoon in May, the foundation hosted its 15th anniversary celebration in the garden. Tables lined the lawn, draped in white cloth, framed by strings of golden light. I stood at the podium looking out at a crowd that felt more like family than an audience. Rachel was among the volunteers, moving gracefully between tables. Her apology from years ago had grown into quiet action, steady, consistent without expectation. My mother couldn't be there. She'd passed peacefully the previous winter, but I'd visited her often in those final months. We had made our peace the way Walter would have wanted. When the speeches ended, the twins joined me on stage. Lila held the microphone, her voice clear and steady. "This started as one man's kindness," she said. "He opened his door for my mom when no one else would. He taught her how to build, and she taught us to do the same. We're proud to carry his legacy forward." The applause that followed felt like sunlight itself, warm, steady, reaching everyone it touched. As the evening wound down, I walked to the edge of the garden where Walter's memorial stone stood beneath the oak tree. The inscription was simple: "Love builds what time cannot break." I placed a single white lily there, the same flower we had brought to Mark's grave years before. The wind rustled through the branches above me, carrying the faint sound of laughter from the celebration. It felt like both of them, Mark and Walter, were still here, woven into every leaf, every voice, every life that had found hope through ours. I stayed there a while, watching the lights flicker as the sun slipped behind the hills. My heart felt full, not from triumph, but from peace, the kind that doesn't need to be loud or perfect to feel whole. The girl I once was, standing in that cold apartment clutching 2 crying babies, had never imagined this life. But she had learned one lesson at a time, that strength isn't measured by what you endure, it's measured by what you build afterward. When I finally turned back toward the house, the path glowed softly beneath the string lights. Lila and Owen were waiting at the steps, waving me over. As I reached them, Owen slipped his arm around my shoulder. "You did it, Mom," he said. I smiled. "No," I told him. We did. Later that night, after the guests had gone and the house had grown quiet again, I sat by the window of Walter's old study. The chair creaked the same way it used to. I looked out across the garden, where new blooms were just beginning to open, and whispered, "Thank you for every open door." Outside, a breeze stirred the curtains, carrying the faint scent of lilies through the room. I closed my eyes and let it fill the silence. If you've ever felt like the world turned its back on you, remember there's always another door waiting somewhere. Sometimes it just takes one act of courage or one act of kindness to find it. And when you do, hold it open for the next person who needs it. Thank you for listening to my story. If it touched something in you, share it with someone who might need a little light tonight, and keep your heart open to the doors that love builds.